Okay, I think we'll make a start. A very warm welcome to everybody. It's an absolute huge privilege and a great honor to be in front of you here to welcome Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta, the one and only Pratap Bhanu Mehta. But before I introduce him, let me introduce very briefly the Global Humanities Initiative, because Pratap has been actually central to it. He was the first person that Hans van der Ven, who's here, the professor of modern Chinese history, as well as the deputy vice-chancellor, Chris Young, the former head of the School of Arts and Humanities, and Ezra Ozarek, also the Sultan Qubus chair in the Faculty of Divinity, and but I came slightly later into it, but I was very happy to have been also kind of connecting vector with Pratap. So it's an absolute joy to have him here for these very important university series in the Global Humanities, for which Global Humanities Initiative is also very thankful to Trinity College and Carlos Fonseca in particular for the generous funding which has allowed us to host speakers such as Pratap. So I shall not say very much because there are very few people whose renown and fame is as well earned as Pratap's. And Pratap, of course, if you're in India, but also globally, but particularly in India, helps, as it were, order our very disordered political discourse. So his column has been absolutely essential to the way we think about politics now and Indian democracy for certainly 20 years. He has also been a very major institution builder in India, which is no mean achievement, starting with the Center for Policy Research, where he was president, and then, of course, as vice-chancellor of the Liberal Arts University, Ashoka, which also happens to partner with 6 other Global South universities of the Global Humanities, but it is thanks to Pratap that we have that connection too. So Pratap, of course, has written very widely on the Indian Constitution, on geopolitics, on India's foreign policy, and above all, Indian democracy. He truly is a global public intellectual. And he studied at Oxford and has taught, I mean, I cannot keep up, but you name any top university and department, and Pratap has managed to contribute there. And he's currently the Laurence S. Rockefeller Visiting Professor at Princeton University. And so I'm particularly delighted because global political thought is one of those things that has kind of germinated in the world of the letters and public ideas in large measure to Pratap and his encouragement of it, as well as Indian political thought. And I, for one, cannot wait to hear him. And so over to Pratap, who will talk to us about the shape of global political thought in 20th century, methods and narratives. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Professor Kapila, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to the Global Humanities Program for this extraordinarily generous invitation and this really exciting initiative. It is, I must confess, a bit intimidating being here and it kind of almost inaugurating this program. I think I'm not sure I can rise up to that burden. But it's also intimidating because I should acknowledge the presence of many colleagues and friends, Richard Tuck, but especially John Donne, who, of course, for many, many years has been our foremost teacher. And what I'm going to say today is a little footnote in some ways to an essay that he wrote a few years ago as a tribute to the very much missed late Ishtvan Hont. And John's essay was, I think, titled, was a kind of resounding call for a kind of global political theory in some ways. And it was that essay that kind of set me thinking into, okay, if you were to do a global history of political thought in the 20th century, what shape would that history take? That's really, in a sense, what today's lecture is going to reflect on in rather kind of reckless and bold and 30,000 feet view of the subject. And the subsequent 3 lectures will hopefully be a little bit more disciplined, in a sense, by their context. The first one is on India. The second on, I have a kind of take on Islamic political thought. And the third is going to do something innovative. Hopefully it works. Try and look at the question of representation through the question of the idea of the party as a political form in the 20th century, not just in party states as regimes, but also in multi-party democracy systems. And I'll explain why those 3 were chosen, hopefully by the time we kind of finish today's lecture. Now, I will answer John's question, or the challenge that John Donne posed in that marvelous essay on global political thought, calling for a history of global political thought, or truly global history of political thought. Actually, there is a difference between the two, but truly global history of political thought. By taking a slightly circuitous route and referring to one other previous discussion of this that happened in the 1930s. And interestingly, this discussion was also the inauguration of what would have then been the equivalent of global humanities program. So in 1936, the Indian philosopher and future president, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, delivered his inaugural lecture as Spalding Professor of Eastern Religion and Ethics. And the title of that lecture was The World's Unborn Soul. And in a sense, my title is actually, you can see, a riff-off of Radhakrishnan's title, right? Radhakrishnan's lecture is pertinent for a number of reasons. The first was the occasion itself, which has great parallels to the inauguration of this Global Humanities Initiative. In fact, the creation of the Spalding Chair of Eastern Religion and Ethics was the first major initiative at Oxford to actually broaden ethical and moral conversation to include the rest of the world in at least formal terms. And Radhakrishnan begins by acknowledging that, right? And the lecture was in some senses a reflection on the circumstances that had led to the need for such a chair and such global initiatives and conversations. Radhakrishnan was also consciously aware that he was speaking to a university setting, and he described the university as, to quote, a fellowship of men and women united in their loyalty to the supreme ideal of truth and in their resolution to practice it for the welfare of humanity. What a quaint idea. This demand, of course, in Radhakrishnan's articulation was not innocuous, because part of the aim of that lecture was to actually argue quite resolutely that the pursuit of truth and a genuinely global ethical conversation could not be made subordinate or immobilized either by the demands of identity or, in a sense, parochial privilege. But I found Radhakrishnan's lecture of particular interest for this occasion for, in a sense, a more substantive reason. And the substantive reason was, in a sense, was because he set out an agenda for what he thought global humanities conversation actually might look like, of which a conversation of political theory might be a part in some ways. And I think it is worth revisiting briefly what that agenda was and why, in a sense, or what's the distance we have traveled from that agenda, and how that story might illuminate what other kinds of agendas we might need at actually this juncture. So Radhakrishnan's text, The Unborn Soul, was in some senses a very odd text in terms of the mood in which it was written, right? At one level, it's a text remarkably free of rancor and resentment. Its vision of global humanities is open and resplendent. He, of course, takes a swipe at every kind of parochialism. He says the recovery and training of classics cannot cease with the listening of the voices of Isaiah and Paul, Socrates and Cicero. That would be an error, a failure of perspective. There are others who have participated in the supreme adventure of the ages, the prophets of Egypt, the sages of China, the seers of India, who are also guiding posts to disclosing to us the milestones of our own trials. Right? And then he ends with this rather remarkable phrase. He says, now we ought to treat the whole world as our cultural base. It's quite a remarkable phrase, actually, the whole world as a cultural base. What might he actually mean by that? And I'll come to that in a second. But the essay was also remarkably free from any trace of post-colonial or the resentment of the colonized for a number of reasons. Like most anti-colonial thinkers writing in the 1920s and 30s, perhaps following Gandhi's example, for Radhakrishnan, colonialism should not, in a sense, generate resentment. And in part, it should not generate resentment because for him, like many of them, colonialism was a symptom, not a cause. Diagnosing it required diagnosing the crisis of civilization itself. It emanated from a crisis of the human condition, not just a particular pathology in some senses of the colonizer. Right? It was also an essay remarkably free of resentment because Radhakrishnan still, this of a generation 1930s, it's the heyday of anti-colonial movements. And one of the things that anti-colonial movements imparted to many thinkers like Radhakrishnan was a sense of the possibility of their own agency. And I think, just as an aside, I think one of the things to think about is why anti-colonial conversation on global political thought had somewhat less trace of resentment than post-colonial thinking has about the shape of global political thought. And I suspect one of the reasons for that, and again, this will be a theme that will come up again later, one of the reasons for that is because, as I said, not just that the crisis of colonialism was understood to be a kind of crisis of humanity as such, right? Not a crisis just of a parochial culture, but also because anti-colonial movements had this sense of political possibility. There was a new world waiting to be born that could be made through our political agency. Colonialism was a condition you could escape, but post-colonialism is a condition you cannot escape. It, in a sense, reflects a sense of thwarted agency. And I think this was one of the big themes that I think Radhakrishnan then developed in many ways. Now, Radhakrishnan's diagnosis of what this crisis of civilization was would have been very familiar to, I think, most thinkers in the 1930s. It has the standard ingredients, right? Which is the emancipated individual now discovering how fragile their own self is and how much, in a sense, they are unable to control or be fully conscious of their own agency as individuals. He sees, for example, the turn to irrationalism and psychoanalysis as symptoms of the fragility of the modern individual self. It partakes very much of the critique of modern rationalism, which on the one hand, in a sense, promises emancipation through science and technology. On the other hand, it subjects individual particularity to a kind of universal technocratic rationality. There's the critique of the modern state as a kind of unprecedented power that might pose threat to individuals. So there's a kind of standard package of like criticisms of modern civilization that Radhakrishnan dwells upon. But the central crisis for him, if you were to ask this question, okay, so what is the central crisis of civilization that Radhakrishnan is talking about? Is what might be described as, and this phrase is mine, not his, but this is how I would reconstruct his argument, is the crisis of political agency. What does he mean by that? Radhakrishnan points out that one of the remarkable features of the 20th century is that it has been marked by an explosion of political agency. One of the features of the modern world is that the demand for political agency is almost ubiquitous. This is the demand that as political actors, we get to shape the world we live in. This was manifest, of course, not just in the great revolutionary tradition coming out of the French revolutions and the 19th century revolutions, which are in a sense the most kind of articulate, extreme demand for agency, where in a sense you can remake almost entire facets of your world through human intention and human design. This demand for agency is, of course, also reflected in movements for decolonization. But interestingly, even the ubiquitous use of the word democracy, right, has something to do with this aspiration for agency. The dominant association of democracy is not, in this view, with the idea of checks and balances, liberal rights, separations of powers, parties, representation. It is, in a sense, this idea that what democracy is above all, right, is an opportunity for people to exercise collective agency of one sort or the other. And that it was going to be characteristic of the modern world that no matter what kind of regime you have, what tradition it comes from, Islamic, Chinese, it would at some point have to legitimize itself with reference to the agency of the people in whose name it actually spoke. Now, Radhakrishnan's big worry was that there is a profound gap between this aspiration to agency that the modern world unleashes and the structures that inhibit it in different ways. And there were three structures he had particularly in mind, which he thought ought to be the object of a conversation of global humanities. The first was, of course, the early 20th century version of globalization. Radhakrishnan wrote, "For the first time in the history of our planet, our inhabitants have become one whole. Each and every part is affected by the fortunes of every other. Science and technology, without aiming at this result, have achieved this unity. Economic and political phenomena are increasingly imposing on us an obligation to treat the world as a unit. Currencies are linked, commerce is international, political fortunes are interdependent." And yet, Radhakrishnan argues, the forms of political organization we inhabit, the consciousness which we embody in our daily lives, the identities to which we give allegiance, and the forms in which we imagine our political agency are still structured in ways that mask this obvious fact of interdependence. As he writes, quote, "The sense that mankind must become a community is still a casual whim, a vague aspiration, not generally accepted as a conscious ideal or an urgent practical necessity." I think the phrase urgent practical necessity might remind you of John. "Moving us to feel the dignity of a common citizenship and the call of common duty. Attempts to bring about this consciousness of the world as a whole through mechanical means, through political adjustments, have by and large proved abortive." And what worried Radhakrishnan was this incredible misalignment between what forces determine our fate and the ambit and institutional channels through which we actually exercise our political agency in some ways. Right? This mismatch between the scope of our agency and what actually impinges on our fates, Radhakrishnan says, is a cause of, in a sense, profound worry, and in a sense, a starting point for a conversation of global humanities. The second sense in which our sense of agency is thwarted, so one is this mismatch, in a sense, between globalization and our parochialism, is Radhakrishnan lives in an age of nationalism, 20th century. The creation and formation of national communities has been a vehicle for the creation of modern forms of citizenship and, therefore, a very profound form of political agency. But the process of forming these communities itself has been fraught with deadly violence and created new exclusions and denials of agency in the process. John Donne once called nationalism the starkest political shame of the 20th century, and the deepest and most intractable and yet most unanticipated blot on the political history of the world since the year 1900. Right? Radhakrishnan would have totally agreed. Radhakrishnan's argument was that actually a global history would have to pay attention to the fact that so much of politics, so much of where our agential power is exerted, takes place in a zone that is actually deeply uncomfortable for reason, for ethical thinking, and for political philosophy as such. It takes place in the zone where we have to, in a sense, maintain boundaries around our identity, right? Boundaries proclaim identity and stand to repeal difference. They signify exclusion, keep out, or keep inside. Almost every normative theory of the 19th, 20th century, from liberalism to socialism, struggled to articulate a political theory of membership. And you might argue that struggles over membership are to the 20th and 21st century what wars of religion were to the 17th and 18th century in some ways. And yet it was one of the odd features of our political theorizing that we think that the apparatus that was appropriate to thinking about wars of religion, in some senses, is the same apparatus that you might need to resolve disputes over membership. In some ways, I mean, and you might say that's the kind of crisis of liberalism, or at least one facet of the crisis of contemporary liberalism. The challenge for Radhakrishnan was that the site of theorizing often is not what happens if we all gather together in the space of reasons. It is rather what happens to the struggle to be granted any standing in a space of reasons at all, which, in a sense, is the essence of modern citizenship, right? How do societies that are otherwise so self-aware, right, structure formations of authority that treat outsiders, individuals or groups, right, as objects whose political agency has to be denied, right? And Radhakrishnan is deeply aware that one of the challenges here is that actually the nation-state form is a profound form of political agency. Its effect, its attraction is that, right? And yet it also is one of the most potent forms in which our political agency is, in a sense, disabled, right? He had a deeper critique of nationalism. It promoted a form of vicariousness. He says, nations have become mysterious symbols to us, to whose protection we rally, as savages to fetishes. Those who are anxious to live in peace with their own kind and species, and with all life, will not find it possible to gloat over the massacres of large numbers of people, simply because they do not belong to their race or country. And then he goes on to add, to quote, our normal attitudes to other nations, races, or outsiders are no more than artificial masks. Habits of thought and feeling sedulously cultivated by long practices of dissimulation. Right? I mean, in a sense. The third facet of agency, in a sense, this promise of agency being thwarted. So again, the paradox, right? Globalization thwarts it, the nation state, at least in the context of globalization. But the third facet was even deeper and subtler. One of the paradoxes of agency in the modern world, right, is that we do not think that nature imposes any necessary constraints on us. In fact, one of the hallmarks of the ubiquitous demand for agency is that in some senses we think of nature also as something that is literally constructed. Not only is nature constructed, we can re-engineer our planet, we can re-engineer our cells, we can re-engineer our biology in some ways, right? But the concept of nature itself, right, is in a sense a kind of construction. And it is actually remarkable how widespread that notion from Radhakrishnan to Aurobindo in Indian thought actually is in the 1930s, right? That there is something about, in a sense, you might say, the modern desire, the modern impulse to express agency through the mastery of nature, through the overcoming of nature, right? That is extremely radical and has been enormously successful, right? And yet the paradox is, right, that we actually find it harder to recreate, in some ways, the social institutions which we actually inhabit, right? And for Radhakrishnan, like for most people in the 1930s, the two big social institutions in some senses was the nation-state form, and he didn't use the word, but something that we would call capitalism. These two institutions, and the institutional life they create, systematically immobilize the demands for justification, either in the name of reason of state, as in the case of the nation state, or in the name of some economic necessity. It is modernity and liberalism's greatest achievement to have posed the question, how do we justify our collective arrangements in ways that treat people as free and equal individuals who come together to self-consciously create the social worlds they inhabit, right? And yet, the organization of both the state and the economy systematically thwart this ambition. The demands of justification are immobilized in the name of necessity. And the paradox, which is kind of almost Hobbesian in character in some ways, that actually it is not nature that imposes any constraint. It is actually our own artifice that we have to naturalize as a form that we inhabit and whose necessity we cannot escape, right? And again, that's what produces a kind of alienation in some ways. That on the one hand, you have this promise of rearranging a world according to our willful political agency, and yet that promise being constantly mobilized by. You can't do that. Why? Out of some argument for necessity, economic necessity or reasons, the state. Right? And so Radhakrishnan's challenge to a global humanities conversation was, can we think of forms of political agency that enable to get us outside of the constraints that these three features of our condition, the form of our globalization and that mismatch between globalization and our agency, the form that the nation state takes in relation to membership and identity, right? And right, the overwhelming sense in which we treat the structures of economy and state as products of necessity rather than willful creation. The task of a global humanities conversation, global political theory conversation, would be, in a sense, to think of what enables us to, in a sense, escape these conditions. Now, Radhakrishnan's own solution, you might find quite timid and probably as much a symptom of the phenomenon he's describing as, in a sense, an answer to it. His own solution was, as was the case with many thinkers in Indian political thought in the 20th century, was a form of spiritual overcoming. That the route to imagining a new world that lies beyond these constraints of agency is to, in a sense, as Radhakrishnan puts it, imagine our unborn soul. And notice the focus is on unborn soul. It is not on the unborn world. Thinking of forms of collective agency that overcome these constraints and aporias that, in some senses, I just outlined. And you could argue, I think much in the spirit of Radhakrishnan himself, just as he saw psychoanalysis, you could actually turn his argument on about psychoanalysis against himself, that this turn to inwardness, right, a kind of radical spiritual reattunement of the soul, for which you could then mobilize the great teachings of all the religions with Vedanta as the center. But that reattunement, in a sense, of the soul, right, was itself a kind of cop-out answer to the question of which he himself has so profoundly posed about the centrality of political agency. So you could say, okay, this was one project, one way of defining this project of a global political thought in the 20th century around different conceptions of agency. And there are different equivalents in different contexts. I mean, one could actually argue American pragmatism at its base actually is really a philosophy that places agency up front and center. In fact, agency goes all the way down, even to articulation of conceptions of truth in some ways, right? In a sense, it's the deed in some ways, right? That in a sense defines the meaning of our action. The revolutionary political traditions continued in the Bolshevik form, but most profoundly Maoism. As you know, Mao very once famously said that he thought of himself as combining American pragmatism with Russian revolutionary fervor, right? And it's not as kind of flippant a remark as you might think, as I might gesture to that again in a sense in the third lecture. But what is, I think, undeniable is that if you look at the space of 20th century political thought, Islamic political thought, Maududi, who I'll talk about a little bit about in the third lecture, right? Even a thinker like Maududi has to answer this question that yes, even if we accept the sovereignty of God, what role does democracy play in the articulation of that sovereignty, right? I mean, think of a paradoxical concept like theodemocracy. You might prima facie think that it's a concept that's an oxymoron at one level. You can either have theology or democracy. You can't have both. But what is politically significant about it was, again, in a sense, this need to refer back, right, to the idea that if a modern political system is not seen as emanating from the self-conscious agency of the people, in a sense, who inhabit it, or at least that connection is not established, it will produce perpetual alienation. Now, what I want to do for, in a sense, the remaining few minutes is switch gears a bit and say, look, this was one genre in which the shape of 20th political thought was understood as search for these different forms of political agency that are thwarted by the crisis of civilization. And that crisis of civilization genre really was quite remarkable till World War II, and then it almost disappeared. It almost disappeared for a variety of reasons. Of course, first, post-colonial movements, anti-colonial movements settled into accepting exactly those necessities and constraints that Radhakrishnan so fretted and worried about, which is the consolidation of the nation-state form, adjustment to modern forms of development rather than thinking of outside of their horizons. The absolute catastrophes of World War II, the persistence of the Cold War, in a sense, lowered the ambition of political theory. Perhaps alienated liberalism was the best we could do, rather than in some senses worry about, in a sense, raising expectations about these radical forms of forms of agency. Right? So, what shape does this discourse then end up taking post World War II? And here I want to kind of just put forward a proposal that then frames the next three lectures. So there are different ways of dividing up the kind of ideological history of post-war global political thought. The most obvious ways, particularly in the American academy, are to see it as a kind of contest between democracy and authoritarianism. Right? A second obvious way is to see it as a contest between socialism and capitalism, or capitalism and its alternatives in different forms, right? Within a sense, one form, with all its variations, at least triumphing in all kinds of qualified ways. Right? But what I want to propose here, just as a heuristic with which to think with, is that post-World War II, if you survey kind of global political thought, you seem to have the emergence of what I would call 4 or 5 meta-traditions. I'm saying the number tentatively. I have a exact number in mind, but I'm going to talk about only 3. So that's. Now, what do I mean by, in a sense, a meta-tradition of global political thought? So, when we think of traditions of political theory, we often think of national traditions in which theorizing takes place, right? But the sense in which I want to use the term of a meta-tradition has the following features. One, that tradition provides a set of foundational values against which subsequent theorizing is legitimized. Second, that tradition provides a corresponding institutional framework, right? And is actually consequential and efficacious in politics. Which is to say, what that tradition spawns is, you might say, to use old-fashioned parlance, a kind of regime type, right? It's not merely a tradition of inquiry, right? Which constructs a tradition by, in some senses, referring to texts of the past. And the tradition is, in a sense, constructed and reconstructed by assimilating more forms of inquiry into it or refuting rival arguments, right? It is actually a tradition that, in some senses, squarely then also is performing the task of the political legitimation of a certain institutional formation and form. And finally, this tradition, right, implicitly acknowledges the hegemony of the foundational values that, in some senses, it lays out. These traditions can be internally diverse. There's often a left version of the tradition and a right version of the tradition. But the left and right versions of that tradition, right, in some senses, or the meaning of the term left and right, are in a sense defined from within the horizons of that tradition itself. So let's look at a couple of examples, and then I'll come to global political thought. Think of different kinds of analogies here. Think of John Pocock's great attempt to recover a kind of basic legitimation narrative in his classic book, Ancient Constitution and the Feudal Law. Or think of the function 1776 performs in the United States, or 1789 performs in France. These traditions, in a stylized way, provide the horizons within which much subsequent political theorizing takes place. They provide a horizon in three senses of the term. First, they provide the language in which theoretical reflection is conducted. In the case of the United States, the language of rights, or in the case of France, the language of republicanism. Second, much subsequent political argument is about the meaning of this foundational originary moment. Much writing on French political thought, even till the late 1980s, used to be encapsulated with the term arguing revolution, till Francois Furet finally announced that the end of the French Revolution in 1989, and then we realized maybe it didn't end even then. Of course, these histories are marked by immense ruptures and conflict. There have been several French republics. Think of the Reconstruction Constitution, post-Reconstruction Constitution in the United States as a radical rupture or a different constitution altogether. And yet, these ruptures also have to be understood as continuous with the baseline values of the past, right? And if you think of, in a sense, the experience of Western democracies as well, I mean, in a sense, in England, it was almost kind of never an issue because I think English liberalism, in a sense, always understood itself much more clearly as operating within a kind of horizon of parochial practices, that accumulated over time. But you could say, in some senses, look, American political thought very much is still struggling to overcome the horizon set by 1776. Right? Now, if you use this kind of analogy and you survey, in a sense, ideological systems around the world, right, one thing becomes kind of obvious, that there are, as I said, 3 or 4, 5, depending on how you want to count it, foundational narratives of this kind that actually become quite powerful in post-World War II political thinking. Right? And I'll just name 4 for our purposes, and then I'll explain why I'm choosing the 3. I've given them a catchy name just to kind of concentrate our mind. Let's call them Madison, Mao, Maududi, and Mandela. Okay? What do I mean by that? The reference to Madison is obvious, which is in a sense liberal pluralist democracy, where the central claim is that the best way in which people's sense of political agency is expressed is through a form of pluralist democracy. And then there's, of course, a debate about how much should this agency be divided and constrained, right? What is the tension, in a sense, between individual agency in that system and forms of collective agency that a demos is genuinely entitled to? Right? The second form, very powerful form, and as you see, Madison is a kind of regime type when we think of the crisis of liberal democracy in some ways, pluralist democracy. The second form is, you might say, the party state as a political form. Right? Now, of course, the party state has its origins in Marxist theory, originally kind of Lenin's reformulation of Marx. The party as a kind of vanguard of revolutionary agency that propels society, that's the bridge between, in a sense, the present and an emancipated future. Right? But what's remarkable about the party state as a political form is that not only does it get institutionalized in a country like China, almost now with a 100-year history, right? I mean, it's at least has as long a history as liberal democracy does, with all its deep fissures, ruptures, violence, and contradictions, right? Right? But you could argue in some ways that much of contemporary Chinese political thought still operates within the horizons of that foundational setting of the party state. Even the debates between the Confucian critique of the party state, Neo-Confucianism, all of this, right, have to take that, in a sense, horizon for granted. Right? The third foundational question, right, which, if you take a large swath of territory running from sort of maybe South Asia to Egypt, again, I'm being very reductionist here, right, is this profoundly interesting question: to what extent can the sovereignty of God, acknowledging the sovereignty of God, be reconciled with modern forms of political agency, modern forms of democracy, right? Or you might say, in a nutshell, the challenge of Islamic constitutionalism, right? It's, in a sense, the kind of meta-narrative within which then different positions are actually articulated in 20th century Islamic political thought. But they have to take that frame of reference, in a sense, for granted. The debates between radicals and reformers, left and right, in China, in the Islamic world, in a sense, take place within these horizons. In Africa, building on, in a sense, the traditions of anti-colonial thought, go back to Fanon, Césaire, the profound aspirations for Pan-Africanism. Right? There was a central question lurking through that political thought, which is, insofar as the color line and race has been an axis of subordination in the global political system, what form of political organization in Africa, right, would be such that prevents that racialized form of subordination to be a central organizational principle of global politics, right? And part, in a sense, of the kind of energy that something like Pan-Africanism drew, right, was, in a sense, from that foundational question. And in a sense, you might say, a lot of African political thought has been struggling, in a sense, with that question. Now, one of the claims I want to make when you're talking about sort of methods and narratives in 20th century global political thought is that much is being written about the crisis of liberal democracy. And the crisis of liberal democracy, in part, is being explained in terms of one of the central categories that was so central to Radhakrishnan's thinking, which is, in a sense, the sense of a loss of agency in modern democracy. Right? Richard Tuck's kind of, one of the most sophisticated authors on agency in modern democracy. Right? But I think one of the powerful insight from Richard's work in thinking about democracy, right, is the fact that the crisis of liberal democracy is in part this crisis, that the forms in which we started imagining democracy, whether in its kind of transnational context, whether through the liberal checks and balances, whether through the myth of constitutionalism, that paradoxically almost all of those forms which we thought would help maintain democracy could actually impede democracy under certain conditions. It could in some senses impede that very desire for collective agency, right, that actually animates in some senses so much of modern democracy, right? And so our debate about the legitimizing narrative of liberal democracy very much, in a sense, centers around this tension. But think of the analogous discussion in China. Again, I'm being very reductionist, mindful that there are extraordinary China experts in this room, right? To what extent can the Chinese Communist Party, in a sense, hold on to the basic legitimizing narrative that has managed to make it such a successful party in the 20th century, right? Is its ability to manage its contradictions likely to continue? And of course, there's a range of options, in a sense, on offer. Some theorists like Wang Hui worry about the fact that, right, the Chinese Communist Party no longer is representative, right? And the reason the notion of representation is important to him in some senses is because representation is the form in which that party claims to, in a sense, extend the agency of the people from, in a sense, the present to the future, right? There are others like Yao Yang, who, for example, think that in some senses, the party, in order to muster up kind of that basic legitimation narrative on which it has shored up that basic legitimation narrative, will have to resort to something like an infusion of Confucian values, right, in some senses. That the grounds of that legitimation are going to be very different from what they were, in some senses, the traditional party state. But one of the remarkable things about this debate is that, again, in some senses, it takes that horizon of the party state for granted, right? Islamic constitutionalism, right? If you look at political theory debates from Pakistan to Iran to Egypt, that central question, can that potential tension, right, between the theo part and the democracy part of theo-democracy actually in some senses be reconciled? Or has that tension reached a point, right, of aporia where something has to give? Right? And my submission to you, kind of, and we'll talk about this in the next 3 lectures in some senses in much more detail, is one way of thinking about this particular moment and the conversation of global political thought, is to say that these master narratives, these meta-traditions of political legitimization that had got deeply institutionalized, not just discursively in different parts of the world, but actually politically and institutionally, each of them are facing a kind of internal crisis of their own. The crisis does not mean they're going to collapse, right? These are very enduring and sticky, resilient regime forms, right? But it is a sense of crisis in the sense that, right, the project internally unleashes expectations about what forms of human agency will be realized under those projects that are inherently in tension with each other. And one of the tasks of a global history of, in a sense, 20th century politics would be to actually look at these master legitimation narratives and diagnose what their own internal crisis, in a sense, actually might be. The one advantage of doing this is that it would reconnect our global histories of political thought to actual politics much more closely, right? Again, John Donne, Bernard Williams at this university often used to emphasize the fact that in some senses politics operates in the realm of legitimacy, not in the realm of truth, right? To be in a political relationship to someone is to owe them a justification of some kind for the arrangement and terms that govern that relationship. A justification that they could, given their other commitments, their internal reasons, they could reasonably accept. The central problem of politics in this view was figuring out what makes a given historical structure an intelligible order of authority. And one of the claims I've been making in this lecture, in some as a kind of prelude to other three, that the master narratives that have, in some senses, given historical structures an intelligible order of authority are actually now deeply struggling to legitimize themselves. And what I'll try and do in the next three lectures is go into detail into three examples of that, hopefully in a but much more disciplined way, to, in a sense, explain what I mean. And this could be, in a sense, the final twist, a different way of saying that what we cannot do, perhaps, is recreate Radhakrishnan's conversation about the crisis of civilization. But what we can do is, in a sense, look at the parallel ways in which all the four master narratives of the 20th century that I referred to, Madison, Mao, Mododi, and Mandela, are undergoing a crisis of their own, and what we might learn from that crisis. Thank you.